Go नः धिधिध रंग रंग भंग वाजे अंग धिधिध रंग रंग भंग वाजे अंग गायचे छंद भगतरिंद आरती तोमार गायचे छंद भगतरिंद आरती तोमार जय जय आरती तोमार हर हर आरती तोमार शिव शिव आरती तोमार खंडन भव बंधन जगबंधन वंदितो जय श्री गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ओम ह्रीं ह्रीतं त्वमचलो गुणजी गुणेढ्या नक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीन बन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छं तलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदमे न च भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीन बन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसा त्वयि तृप्त तृष्णा रागे कृते हृतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मत्यमृतं तव पदं मरणोन्मिनाशं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीन बन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारी स्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेकगम्य तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीन बन्धो। ॐ संस्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्म स्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। सर्वमंगल मांगल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टि स्थिति विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातनी गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागत दीनार्त परित्राण परायणे सर्व शान्ति हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
First, check. Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So, we are at the end of this lecture by Vivekananda called Maya and Freedom. And it's at this point that he talks about the resolution of this problem that this lecture began with. Namely, that our day-to-day life is defined in terms of certain conflicts and contradictions at various levels, not just emotional, but even at the level of epistemology, intellect. In all aspects of our being, these two antipodes characterize and define our existence. And so this attempt to be free is something that आवाज आ रहा है वहां से फीडबैक नहीं नहीं माइक नहीं यहां से कुछ आवाज आ रहा है हाँ yes sorry about that so conflicts which keep on defining our existence and every moment we try to aspire for freedom we are circumscribed by various things around us and they force us to accept our limitations. And so the aspiration for freedom, how is it to be met? And so these ideas of, after that, towards the end, last time we discussed this, that the awareness of one's limitations, right from pagan or primitive religions where people worshipped ancestors and forces of nature, there is this idea that something is beyond these limitations. So, for instance, at some point of time, one understands that, look, one settles down as a species and starts growing crops. And so the food that one grows is not entirely under one's control because it's dictated by what the weather will be, whether there'll be enough rains to support the crops, and whether there'll be too much rain which will destroy the crops. So there is this optimum thing that is necessary, and that weather is not in our control. So one starts worshipping a certain weather god which is far away and tries to propitiate that so that rains will be sent in time. Why is this? It's basically because there isn't enough understanding, enough clarity about what the weather is like, which means what the weather will be like tomorrow, what the weather will be like for the next few months. It's because of this uncertainty, because of our human inability to look into the future, that this kind of uncertainty and fear crops up. And essentially the fear is one of being destroyed. If there are no crops, there's no food, and people will die. Essentially, it's the fear of death in some form or the other. Fear of losing something which is dear to one. And of course, life itself is the most dear to all of us. And so, there is a development of a deity, so to speak, which is in charge of this weather, and one tries to propitiate that. Slowly, these individual ideas started merging, and essentially a unification in terms of a god of nature, in charge of all of external nature, came into existence. And this is what monotheism is about. So we had traced this development of religious thought till this coming of monotheism in the last class. And we had read out the very last paragraph of this lecture. And essentially the problem that arose was that, okay, fine, we have posited this deity or this one god of nature who is free from nature, but then there isn't enough clarity in the sense that knowledge, or which is basically the same as clarity here, is not quite present. And so the last step from a monotheistic God to this non-dualistic idea of consciousness itself comes in. And this is where this lecture ends. And I'll just read out this paragraph and then we'll carry on analyzing it. Here Vedanta begins where these monotheistic ideas first appear. But the Vedanta philosophy wants further explanation. Here is the crucial point. Wanting further explanation. Wanting further explanation means seeking greater clarity, seeking clearer knowledge, seeking greater truths. That's the aspiration. It's all very fine to posit something beyond nature, but at a certain level, the inquiring mind feels dissatisfied by that explanation because it says, oh, that's a story. Why is that not just an imagination, and why is it the truth? Because after all, if we are to rest our minds on something, then that permanence of rest can only come when we rest our minds on truth. So is this monotheistic God of nature, beyond nature, that we concluded with, posited, is that true? Or is it just an imagination? Is the development of human knowledge today not enough to explain these vagaries of weather? And so human knowledge develops, and today we have a well-developed field called meteorology. This was not there a couple of thousand years back. And so the act of propitiating a God outside of these rains, outside of these clouds, that need has vanished from, or has largely vanished from, human society today. So we don't have a separate God for water, Varuna, or a separate God for thunder, Indra, etc., 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 etc. But this God behind nature, this monotheistic God, that carries on. But and the enquiry has to a great extent turned within, and there has been a kind of a unification. But that clarity, if it is to be sought, if it is to be understood, then even this monotheistic, this idea of monotheism, namely a God of nature outside of this nature, is not satisfactory enough. Greater clarity is necessary. This is exactly what is meant by the Vedanta philosophy wants further explanation. If the mind is not enquiring enough, and one is satisfied with this narrative, that there is this one God outside of nature, and that closes off all enquiry, one is satisfied with that, one need go no further. But it is this dissatisfaction in the enquiring mind that leads to something deeper, something further. It's the mind that inquires, but what's the proof of such a thing? Why is this not just a narrative? The enquiring mind, the enquiring intellect wants to know something deeper than this, wants to know the truth. Not a narrative, not a story. And it's this quest for truth that makes us penetrate further, not just into nature, but introspect more deeply into ourselves. The explanation, and this is exactly what he reiterates here, this explanation that there is a being beyond all these manifestations of Maya, who is superior to and independent of Maya, and who is attracting us towards himself, and that we are all going towards him, is very good, says the Vedanta, but yet the perception is not clear. This is the key point. Lack of clarity. Clarity can come only when one has this incontrovertible proof that this is true. Not clear. The vision is dim and hazy, although it does not directly contradict reason. Just as in your hymn it is said, nearer my God to thee, the same hymn would be very good to the Vedantin, only he would change a word and make it nearer my God to me. In other words, what is being posited as something far away is brought closer and closer into our consciousness here and now. That is the way one gains clarity. Basically, the question one is asking is, all right, who has posited this deity in charge of nature? And essentially the answer comes, well, it is society or groups of individuals. But then groups of individuals have spun a narrative, which means an individual himself or herself has actually come up with this explanation, which means that that explanation has appeared in the subjective human consciousness. Question, What if that person who came up with this explanation is not quite right? So one brings it back to oneself and asks, am I satisfied with this explanation? Which means, in my consciousness, does it appear to be true? Does it appear to be incontrovertible? And if that query, that inquiring mind is not satisfied, then something deeper, something clearer, something truer must be sought. And it is this process of inquiry that leads to this Vedantic inquiry here. This process of inquiry that leads to this further exploration by Vedanta here. The idea that the goal is far off, far beyond nature, attracting us all towards it, has to be brought nearer and nearer without degrading or degenerating it. The God of heaven becomes the God in nature. And the God in nature becomes the God who is nature. And the God who is nature becomes the God within this temple of the body. And the God dwelling in the temple of the body at last becomes the temple itself, becomes the soul and man, and there it reaches the last words it can teach. He whom the sages have been seeking in all these places is in our own hearts. The voice that you heard was right. This quest for freedom was right. But, says the Vedanta, but the direction you gave to the voice was wrong. This idea that there's a God sitting above the clouds, typically in theology, there's an old bearded man, white bearded, sitting above the clouds. So that idea essentially is okay. So that's a monotheistic or a particular kind of monotheism. On the other hand, there is this idea which comes from pantheism, more familiar with people in this country, namely that there is a God behind one force of nature, there is another God behind another force of nature, and so on. So there's a water God, there's a rain God, there's a wind God, there's a fire God, etc., 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 etc. And finally it becomes this God of nature. But that's somehow remote. Its distance from the individual is very far. Where is this distance? Is it some kind of a physical distance we are talking about? No. If the distance was physically far, then all that one would need to do would be to manufacture rockets which were capable of penetrating into space. And then somewhere or the other we would find this person we are hunting for. But that's not the point. Where is this inquiry to be executed? And then it's not, the idea then becomes that it's not to be sought outside. These ideas have emerged in our consciousness, subjective consciousness itself. So if inquiry is to be made, it is to be made into the instrument which feels dissatisfied, namely our subjective minds themselves. And it is in our hearts, this question needs to be asked, what am I really seeking? Which means that these ideas of something beyond nature, something that we indicate by this word freedom, is not sought outside in terms of societies. It's not sought in terms of societal conditions. It's not sought in terms of natural conditions. It's not sought in terms of external conditions defining life, but as something in ourselves, some dimension to our existence itself, which is not conditioned by these limitations. That is what freedom really means. Freedom does not mean something outside. You don't say that this camera in front of me is free, or if I manage to get into that camera, I would be free. No. If freedom consisted of just going out into a field, then we would just go out into a field and we'd feel free. But we don't. Why? Because we carry our mental conditionings, our subjective being with us. And it is there that this sense of bondage lies. So we'll have to inquire into ourselves, asking, what is it in us that makes us feel bounded, makes us feel as if we are bounded creatures today, right now? And these are the obstacles to freedom. The obstacles to freedom don't lie outside. The crucial and the greatest obstruction to freedom is fear. Fear of what? Fear of various things. Above all, fear of death. Why? Because this body in and through, and this body and mind in and through which we know this world, we definitely do accept that it's not something that's going to go on lasting. And therefore there is this fear of losing it. And through that, there's a fear of losing various other things which cling to us because of this association with an individuated existence. So, if there is this notion of bondage within us, in terms of our emotional lives, in terms of our psyche, in terms of these attachments, hatreds, and fears, then as soon as one becomes aware of these things arising in our minds and hearts, we tautologically become identified with this word. I said aware, becoming aware. We automatically get identified with this awareness. As soon as one, so there is this, say for example, one could be very angry this moment, and one could step back just a little bit and become aware of that anger. Is that aspect of our being which is aware of the anger angry? Not quite. It is just regarding this anger as an object of knowledge. So there is this subjective detachment that goes on, and anger now becomes an object of perception, an object of awareness. So also about fear. So the nerves might act up and compel us to move in a certain way that we do when we are afraid. These are leftovers of evolution, of biological evolution. And these were necessary for creatures to survive. But what if we become aware of that fear? Then that which is becoming aware is no longer afraid. The fear becomes an object of its perception. This is where the quest leads us. And this is what is meant by nearer, my God, to me. It is in one's consciousness itself that this freedom is to be sought, not outside, not as something external to nature, not as something outside of us controlling nature. When we start thinking in terms of something controlling nature, the worship is of power. But when one turns within, then the aspiration becomes one for knowledge, for clarity, for truth. That is what, basically, We just ask ourselves, okay, I am getting afraid at this moment, or I'm feeling angry at this moment, or I'm feeling very attached to such and such a thing at this moment. As soon as I ask myself, will this particular emotion lead me further towards whatever I am aspiring for? Will my doing something with a lot of passion, lot of emotion, which acts on our nerves and makes them jangled, is that going to even increase my day-to-day work efficiency? If I am aspiring to understand, say, some field of knowledge, won't these emotions come and disturb me? As soon as we ask ourselves these questions, then these rag, dvesha, abhinivesha, this attachment, fear, anger, or hatred, these immediately reveal themselves as something or some things which are not conducive to what we are aspiring for, even in our day-to-day lives. If I'm very angry, what happens is that my mind becomes agitated. Then what I'm looking at, what I'm trying to understand, will no longer be clearly understood, because the mind is going to get thrown into waves, and so my present purpose in gaining clarity, in gaining understanding, in developing some kind of altruistic feeling towards other people, that is going to be hampered in the here and now. So this agitation, which all these emotions invariably lead to, are not conducive to well-being. This is something that we clearly understand. Anger is not good for us in any way. Unless it is used, the energy in that is tapped for some higher purpose. So, and it keeps us bound. So we inquire into it. This is the inquiry. Is this really good for me? And then the answer becomes no. Then will just that answer that no, this is not good for me. Is that good enough? No. How do we get over it? And in order to get over any of these things, we need to become aware of when they are acting on us, when they are making us bound. This is something that can be done while moving, while walking, in every activity, in and through every activity. It is trying to develop this clear introspective aspect of the mind in and through our day-to-day lives. And then one starts understanding that this freedom one is seeking is not outside. It is a dimension of one's own being. This is the meaning of the direction you gave to the voice was wrong. That ideal of freedom that you perceived was correct. The content was accurate. But you projected it outside yourself. And that was your mistake. The place we were hunting for it was not quite correct. Yeah? So, there was this mystic, yeah, in erstwhile Persia called Mullah Nasiruddin. There are these stories, anecdotes about him. On the face of it, they sound funny, but a little bit of thought actually shows that there's something deeper. So, for instance, here's one particular story. This is a translation into Bengali that I read, written by Satyajit Ray, the filmmaker. He also used to write novels and little short stories. So, Nasiruddin was outside his house below a lamppost hunting for something. A friend came along and says, "So what are you hunting for?" This is a key. But where did you lose the key? He said, "I lost the key at home." And then this person asks, so you lost your key at home and you're hunting for it in front of a lamppost. How are you going to get it? So don't you understand? My room is dark. How will I find the key if I hunt for it in my home? Here there is light, so I'm hunting for it. And of course, I mean, it sounds very amusing. But the ridiculous nature of this quest is something that this little anecdote reveals. We are hunting for something which came from within our consciousness, and we are hunting for it outside. We are not hunting for it where we lost it. So these causes of our loss of freedom are not understood and analyzed and erased. Instead, we try to gain our sense of freedom in and through these instruments which are themselves limited. Instead of trying to understand what is the locus of these limitations, we take the limited instrument for granted and project this idea of freedom outside in this kind of vain hope that we'll find it somewhere outside. So this quest for knowledge is to be turned within. So it's not just analytical thinking, but rather an introspective analytical thinking that is being encouraged. In one place, Vivekananda describes this particular faculty as the analytical will of the philosopher. Will. Will means the capacity to hold on to something. So, the analysis from this introspective analysis separates the dross from the essentials. Here, it separates out the sense of freedom inside ourselves from the sense of bondage. But then, this is called viveka, analysis, discrimination. But then, the will has to be associated, or it has to hold on to with strength, subjective internal strength, the dimension that is free, not the dimension that is bound. And when we are using our passions to catch hold of something outside, we are in and through that catching hold of our bondage with great vigor, great strength. It's this detachment of that and holding on to some dimension of ourselves that is free. That is called this viveka plus vairagya. Yeah? So this detachment from that which holds us bound and holding on to that aspect of ourselves which is free, that is being encouraged here. Bring it nearer and nearer until you find that it was all the time within you. It was the self of your own self. That freedom was your own nature, and this Maya never bound you. Nature never has power over you. Like a frightened child, you were dreaming that was throttling you, and the release from this fear is the goal. Not only to see it intellectually. See, this is a discussion that we've had at a certain intellectual level. See, we can go on talking about it till kingdom comes, and there's nothing really that will come of it. Because most of this stuff has been understood at a certain level since human societies began. Essentially, our biological evolution was replaced by societal evolution at a certain stage. And then these instincts of fear, anger, attachment, which were necessary for the preservation of the species before we settled down, those instincts are no longer necessary in the form they were that many thousand years back, or some say maybe even 1,000,000 years back. And this psychosocial evolution kicks in. The reason why all these things are difficult is basically because our biological evolution has shaped us in a certain way. But now we have this apparatus of analysis. It's not strong enough to catch hold of these and throw them away from ourselves. And hence, repeated practice, repeated analysis is necessary. This is really the experimental dimension, the dimension in practice. And it's a kind of practice that can be carried out every moment. Our awareness does not leave us for a moment. Do we exercise it? Do we exercise it to be aware of these aspects of our being that make us feel limited? That is the question we need to be asking ourselves. It does not mean that the moment we ask, all these problems are going to vanish. But at least we become aware of what it is in us that keeps us bounded, that keeps us feeling bounded. Not to see it intellectually, but to perceive it, actualize it much more definitely than we perceive this world. When we shall know that we are free. When we shall know that we are free. What is happening here is that the mind has this instinctive ability to be projected outside. The moment we think of something called freedom, we say, oh, there is this deity sitting outside of us, that's going to give us freedom. There's this freedom deity. Give it some name, and then that's going to be responsible for giving us all kinds of things. Instead of asking, what is it? Basically, this is the question that really turns the mind inwards. What is it in me that makes me feel bounded? What is it in me that is making me seek this freedom? Wherein my own consciousness does this locus of freedom lie? And then one starts identifying aspects of one's subjective, intellectual and emotional life and starts subjecting it to the kind of rigorous analysis that anybody in a scientific lab would do. It's basically taking, and this is really where it differs a little bit from the usual scientific paradigm. There, everything is understood from a third-person perspective, as some object outside of ourselves. Here, the focus is on the first-person perspective, and treating all these emotions and our aspects of our psyche, which we typically call mind, as objects of perception, not as part and parcel of oneself. As soon as one becomes aware of these, there is this detachment, and then one can use that to further one's own life. Then and then alone will all difficulties vanish. When will all the perplexities of heart be smoothed away, all crookedness made straight? When will vanish the delusion of manifoldness and nature, and Maya, instead of being a horrible, hopeless dream, as it is now, will become beautiful, and this earth, instead of being a prison house, will become our playground. And even dangers and difficulties, even all suffering, will become deified and show us their real nature, will show us that behind everything, as the substance of everything, He is standing, and that He is the one real self. So essentially, the inquiry that starts off by looking at various external sources of bondage finally turns within and then starts inquiring into the subjective dimension of freedom itself. when that enquiry starts proceeding with a certain amount of vigor and strength, it becomes clearer and clearer that what one is seeking is one's own self, not something projected, not this habituated mind which projects something outside, but explanations and truth sought inside, sought within. And finally, that dimension of our being becomes stronger and stronger, and these things which frightened us, which made us angry, their significance starts falling away, decreasing gradually, and the aspect of one's being that was free starts taking over various aspects of our lives. And that's the direction. That's the direction of subjective progress. But at each moment, there is going to be a certain sense of limitation. But once one has developed this as a subjective habit, then this capacity for introspective analysis becomes stronger and stronger. And the path itself becomes a delight. Somebody had asked a couple of turns back what the method is. There is no mechanical method. The method is precisely to cultivate this capacity for introspective analysis, being aware and alert at every moment of our existence. Everything that we do, to do that with full attention. And there are various names for this. We have said this before. Let me just reiterate. This is Vivekananda's description. Do whatever you're doing with full attention. The Buddhists call it mindfulness. The Christians call it maintaining the presence or practicing the presence of God, etc., etc. Various traditions, but finally at the bottom of it is this one simple faculty to be cultivated. Alertness in and through all times, basically being aware of the various mental forces within ourselves, not something mystical, not something far off. As the Upanishads say, ihaiva, here itself. That's where this truth needs to be caught. Not in some mystical twilight, but in the full focus of one's own attention. That is the clarity that one is seeking. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.